I was thinking, something that's difficult to articulate to people is that history, particularly colonial history, doesn't necessarily start when you think it starts. This is partially down to the unfortunate double meaning of the word history, partially it's down to a mental blockage. I had an exchange with somebody in the YouTube comments talking about the pre-contact Australians. He cited the memoir of a convict who'd escaped from a penal colony and fled inland. This convict lived with an Aboriginal group for a while before returning to European society. The commenter I was arguing with cited this convict's memoir as a clear account of pre-contact life. As this is the first known white fellow to have written about this particular group, therefore this must be a picture of what life was like before things were disrupted. I tried to explain to this commenter that what he's describing happened a good 20 years after Captain Cook. The fact of penal colonies in Australia means that the pre-contact world has already been disrupted, whether you like it or not. This is without even mentioning the observer effect. This might well be the first image you have, but that doesn't mean it's representative of what was before. You don't get to know what, if anything, had changed between Cook and the penal colony. The account of Saga Mappy within David Thompson's narrative is an interesting resource. The recollection of an old pagan Blackfoot man of the pre-contact world. He lived in an era of extreme disruption, the horse, the gun, disease. The early parts of his narrative before this disruption give a fascinating contrast with the latter parts. One such contrast is his description of battles before and after the gun. These I have previously narrated on my channel. The account of Saga Mappy presents the clearest image we have of the pre-contact world. As good as this image is, it isn't perfect. He describes how some men had iron arrows, iron spears, iron knives, which they had acquired through trade. European technology, iron, horses, guns, often traveled faster than the Europeans themselves, disrupting the pre-contact world to a greater or lesser degree before the Europeans had the chance to document it. We don't get to know whether these iron tools represented a major disruption or an insignificant one. A poorly documented element of early North American history is the impact of the whalers. These were men primarily from the Basque country, but also from Normandy and Brittany. Having extirpated the whales in their local waters, they pursued them across the Atlantic. They set up a number of seasonal whaling and fishing camps in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and Labrador. Their heyday of activity in North America was in the 1500s. They arrived a good 5 years before Cartier and a good 80 years before Champlain. Unfortunately for the historian, these were whalers. They didn't do much writing besides accounting information. The lack of texts that they produced means that they are often excluded from the history of North America. The general history says that it begins with Cartier, and then there's a 60-year gap between then and Champlain when things begin properly. This is clearly an oversimplification. Champlain's account contains numerous little oddities which suggest a certain level of interaction between Basque and indigenous peoples. For instance, when describing people cutting down trees to build hasty fortifications, Champlain mentions that they are using poor axes which they acquire sometimes in trade, or else their own ones of stone. In another instance, one of Champlain's Algonquin allies describes how the Basques are useless allies because they have no stomach for military affairs. They seek only to make war on the peltry of the nation. Champlain's account contains a number of these little offhanded remarks which hint at something much larger. Archaeology bears this out. There are European artifacts at St. Lawrence Iroquoian sites. Clearly the Laurentians were trading with the Basques. Almost everywhere the archaeologists look, they find European artifacts turning up slightly earlier than they ought to be. Here are some glass beads in southwestern Ontario dated to the 1500s. It's likely these were bought from the fishermen and then traded further inland. It's difficult, if not impossible, to know what impact these whalers had on indigenous life. All we know for certain is that it's more than zero. For instance, a favorable position for European trade might position one as middlemen for trading further inland. This might foster new alliances or else new resentments. It will change the balance of power. We see that sort of thing quite often in better documented periods. For instance, in the 1600s the Mohicans acted as middlemen for the musket trade. They grew wealthy and powerful, which fostered resentment and fear among their neighbors. This led to a lengthy war with the Mohawks. I read an interesting theory that suggested that Basque trade might have indirectly had something to do with the destruction of the Laurentians. This idea wasn't particularly well grounded, but I find it fascinating to think about. What happened during all those bits we don't get to see? We can find clues here and there which point us in the correct direction, but ultimately we don't get to know definitively. To conclude in trite fashion, a post-contact image is not a pre-contact image. First contact does not necessarily describe an undisturbed environment. Just a thought.